They owned the ocean, not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. The Royal Navy of the 1770s had spent a century making the claim literal, fighting the Dutch, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and winning. Every time. The sea lanes of the Atlantic, the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, all of them ran through British naval power. You sailed those waters because Britain allowed it. At its peak, the Royal Navy had more than 250 warships. Its sailors were the most experienced in the world. Its gunnery was faster, more accurate, and more sustained than anything any other nation could field. Its officers had been trained on decades of continuous warfare, tested in conditions that produced either excellence or death. And the ones who survived were very good indeed. When the American colonies began their rebellion in 1775, the Royal Navy was the most powerful military force on water that the world had ever seen. And it failed. Not because it was defeated in a single catastrophic battle. Not because its ships rotted, or its sailors mutinied, or its admirals went mad. It failed the way institutions fail when they are asked to do something they were not designed to do. Slowly, expensively, and without anyone quite being able to say when failure became inevitable. The American Revolution was won on land, but it was lost at sea. This is the story of how the most powerful navy in the world lost a war it should have been able to end in a season. To understand how the Royal Navy failed, you have to first understand what it was, because what it was is genuinely extraordinary. The Royal Navy of the 1770s was not just a military force. It was an institution with its own culture, its own traditions, its own economy, and its own logic. It had been built over more than a century of continuous investment, continuous warfare, and continuous refinement. The result was something that operated with a professional confidence that no other navy in the world could match. British warships were divided into rates, 1st through 6th, based on the number of guns they carried. A first-rate ship of the line carried 100 guns or more on 3 decks. When one of these vessels fired a full broadside, it released more iron in a single second than most land armies could fire in a minute. The sound was audible 20 miles away. The men who crewed these ships were the product of a system that had been grinding out professional sailors for generations. Some had volunteered. Many had been pressed, seized from merchant vessels and fishing boats and the streets of port towns by press gangs operating with the full authority of the crown. Pressed men who survived long enough stopped being pressed men and became sailors. The sea made them what it made everyone who spent enough time on it: practical, fatalistic, and very good at their jobs. British naval gunnery was the best in the world, by a considerable margin. The standard rate of fire for a trained British gun crew was 1 aimed shot every 90 seconds, 3 times faster than most French or Spanish crews. In a sustained engagement, this gap was decisive. The first fleet to achieve fire superiority in a naval battle almost always won it. The Navy also had something no other force in the American conflict had: strategic mobility. It could move thousands of soldiers across oceans in weeks. It could appear off any coastline without warning. It could cut off ports, block rivers, and project power anywhere there was water. On paper, the Royal Navy should have ended the American Revolution quickly. It had the ships, the men, the training, and the reach. What it did not have was a strategy that matched what the war actually required. Here is the thing about suppressing a rebellion across a continent-sized territory using naval power. The Navy can control the coasts. It cannot control the interior. America in 1775 was not a maritime nation in the way Britain was. It was a continental nation with a coastline. Its population centers were on the coast: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, but its territory stretched hundreds of miles inland. And that interior was where the rebellion lived, where the Continental Army operated, where the farms and forests and roads that sustained the revolution existed. The Royal Navy could blockade American ports, and it did. It seized merchant vessels. It bombarded coastal towns. It landed troops at will along the entire American coastline. These were real capabilities, and they caused real damage, but they could not win the war. Because the war was not in the ports. The war was in Massachusetts farms and New Jersey river crossings and Pennsylvania forests and South Carolina swamps. The war was in the minds of 3 million colonists who had decided in varying degrees that they did not want to be governed by London, and naval guns cannot change minds. The strategic logic that the Navy's commanders were working with, blockade the ports, cut off trade, starve the rebellion into submission, was based on a model of warfare that applied to European maritime nations who could be isolated by sea power. France could be hurt by blockade. Holland could be hurt by blockade. America was different. It was a self-sufficient agricultural society. It could feed itself, clothe itself, and arm itself from its own interior. Its trade with Europe was important but not existential. Cutting off that trade hurt American merchants. It did not stop the Continental Army from functioning. The British admirals understood their ships. What they understood less well was the nature of the war their ships were being asked to fight. For the first 6 years of the war, the Royal Navy did what it was designed to do. It transported British armies across the Atlantic. It supplied them once they arrived. It landed troops at Long Island, at Newport, at Philadelphia, at Savannah, at Charleston. It supported the coastal operations that gave Britain its major victories. Without the Royal Navy, the British Army in America could not have functioned. But in 1778, something changed that the Navy's commanders had feared from the beginning. France entered the war. The moment France formally allied with America and began openly deploying its fleet, the entire strategic situation transformed. The Royal Navy was no longer facing an enemy without a navy. It was now facing the second most powerful fleet in the world, with the third most powerful, Spain, likely to follow. And suddenly the Navy had too many problems and not enough ships. The Caribbean colonies, Jamaica, Barbados, the Leeward Islands, produced more wealth for Britain than all of North America combined. They had to be defended. The English Channel itself had to be watched. Gibraltar was under threat. India was now a potential theater. The Mediterranean required attention. Every ship sent to reinforce the American theater was a ship not defending somewhere else. Every ship defending somewhere else was a ship not available to end the American war. The Royal Navy was the most powerful single fleet in the world. It was not powerful enough to be everywhere simultaneously, and the moment France and Spain entered the war, everywhere is exactly where it needed to be. The decisive moment came on September 5, 1781, in the Chesapeake Bay. A French fleet under Admiral de Grasse had sailed north from the Caribbean to support the Yorktown operation. A British fleet under Admiral Graves met it off the Virginia coast. The Battle of the Chesapeake lasted less than 3 hours. Neither fleet was destroyed. The damage was roughly equal. By conventional measures, it was barely more than a tactical draw. But when it was over, the French fleet held the Chesapeake. The British fleet, damaged and running low on supplies, sailed for New York to refit. And the Yorktown garrison, 8,000 British soldiers under Cornwallis, was sealed from the sea. The most powerful navy in the world had just lost the decisive naval engagement of the American Revolution. Not because it was outfought, Because it arrived too late with too few ships at a moment when the global demands of a world war had stretched its resources past what any single fleet could manage. One of the great myths of the Revolutionary War is that the British naval blockade was effective. It was not. The logistical requirements of the Continental Army, gunpowder, cannon, muskets, lead, cloth for uniforms, could not all be produced domestically. America needed imports from Europe, particularly from France and the Netherlands, to sustain its military effort. In theory, a complete naval blockade of the American coast should have strangled the revolution within a few years. In practice, the blockade was riddled with gaps. The American coastline from Maine to Georgia stretched more than 2,000 miles. It was indented with hundreds of bays, inlets, river mouths, and natural harbors, many of them unknown to British naval charts. American privateers and small vessels knew these waters intimately. They slipped through the blockade continuously, carrying supplies in and profits out. The British simply did not have enough ships to cover the entire coastline simultaneously. At the peak of British naval deployment in American waters, they had fewer than 30 warships attempting to enforce a blockade across thousands of miles of coastline. An impossible task by any arithmetic. French supply ships, particularly after 1778, made the problem worse. France was technically at war with Britain and could not openly sail supply ships into American ports. It found ways to do so indirectly. Supplies moved through the Caribbean, through neutral Dutch ports in the West Indies, through any gap in the British coverage that French ingenuity and American local knowledge could find. The gunpowder that Continental soldiers used at Bunker Hill was largely French. The cannon that forced the British out of Boston came from Fort Ticonderoga, but the ammunition they fired was partly French. The supplies that kept the Continental Army functioning through Valley Forge arrived despite the blockade, not because it did not exist. The blockade was real. It hurt. It was just not decisive. And in a war of attrition, almost but not quite decisive is the same as failure. The Royal Navy's failure in America was not primarily a failure of its admirals. It was a failure of the strategic situation they were placed in. But the admirals were not blameless either. Admiral Richard Howe, who commanded British naval forces in American waters from 1776 to 1778, was a capable officer who genuinely believed a negotiated peace was possible and let that belief affect his operational decisions. He was slower to press advantages than the situation sometimes required, and his relationship with his brother General William Howe, who commanded the land forces, produced the kind of civil-military coordination problems that plague combined operations when the commanders do not fully agree on the objective. The British naval response to the French entry into the war was also slower than it needed to be. The Admiralty in London was managing competing demands from admirals in different theaters, all of whom believed their theater was the priority. The result was that reinforcements and resources moved more slowly than the strategic situation required, and by the time the full weight of the problem was understood in London, the opportunity to address it had often passed. The fundamental problem was not any individual admiral's competence. The fundamental problem was that the British government was running a global war on global resources that were just barely insufficient for the task. Every decision that sent ships to the Caribbean took ships from America. Every decision that kept ships in the Channel took ships from the Atlantic. The Navy was always one theater short. While the Royal Navy was struggling to blockade American ports and support British land operations, it was also fighting a war it had not fully anticipated against American privateers. Private vessels commissioned by the Continental Congress and individual states to attack British shipping flooded the Atlantic. They were not warships. They were fast, lightly armed merchant vessels converted for raiding. Brigantines, schooners, sloops, crewed by men who knew the coastline and were motivated by the prospect of prize money. At the war's peak, more than 2,000 American privateers were operating in the Atlantic. They attacked British merchant shipping wherever they found it. They captured or destroyed more than 600 British merchant vessels during the war. They drove up insurance rates for Atlantic trade to the point where British merchants began openly lobbying Parliament for peace. The Royal Navy was not designed to chase privateers. Its warships were built for fleet engagements, finding and destroying enemy warships in open battle. Chasing small, fast raiders across thousands of miles of ocean was expensive, time-consuming, and often fruitless. For every privateer the Navy caught, 10 more sailed out of American ports. The privateers did not win the war, but they raised its cost for Britain beyond what anyone had projected at the beginning, and cost was ultimately one of the reasons the war ended when it did. So why did the most powerful navy in the world fail to stop American independence? 3 reasons, and none of them are the ones usually given. First, the war was in the wrong place. Naval power projects force along coastlines and river systems. The American Revolution was won and lost in the interior, in the minds of the population, in the supply depots and farms of the countryside, in the guerrilla actions and strategic retreats that kept the Continental Army alive. The Royal Navy could dominate the coast. It could not dominate the continent. Second, France changed the arithmetic. Before French entry in 1778, the Royal Navy had an overwhelming advantage in American waters. After French entry, that advantage disappeared almost overnight. The Navy was suddenly fighting a global war against 2 European powers with fleets nearly equal to its own. And it had to fight that global war while simultaneously trying to suppress a colonial rebellion. The resources were not there to do both. Third, the blockade was never tight enough. 2,000 miles of coastline, hundreds of inlets and hidden harbors, and fewer than 30 warships at peak deployment. The math never worked. American privateers, French supply ships, and the sheer geography of the American coast made a decisive blockade impossible with the forces available. Supplies got through. The Revolution survived. The Royal Navy was not defeated. It was overwhelmed, not by any single enemy, but by the scale of what it was asked to do and the global competition for the resources it needed to do it. The lessons of the Royal Navy's failure in America echoed far beyond 1783. Britain rebuilt its navy in the years after the Revolution. It drew conclusions, some correct, some not, about what had gone wrong. It invested in more ships, better coordination between land and sea forces, and more systematic thinking about how to fight a global war. Less than 20 years later, those investments paid dividends. The Royal Navy that fought the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars was a more capable, more strategically coherent force than the one that failed in America. Trafalgar in 1805 was the naval engagement that the Chesapeake never was. A decisive destruction of an enemy fleet that confirmed British naval supremacy for a generation. But the American failure left a deeper mark than any tactical lesson could address. It demonstrated something that military planners ever since have struggled to fully absorb: that naval supremacy, however total, cannot by itself win a war against a population that has decided to resist. Sea power can isolate, can harass, can make life difficult and expensive. It cannot govern a continent. It cannot change 3 million minds. The most powerful navy in the world learned this the hard way in American waters between 1775 and 1783. The Royal Navy that sailed home after Yorktown was not a defeated navy in any conventional sense. Its ships were still afloat. Its sailors were still among the best in the world. Its gunnery was still faster than anyone else's. Within 20 years, it would prove all of this at Trafalgar, destroying the combined French and Spanish fleets and confirming British naval supremacy for another century. But in America, against a rebellion, it should have been able to end in a season. It failed because it was given a task that naval power alone could not accomplish: controlling a continent, suppressing a population, maintaining a blockade across 2,000 miles of hostile coastline while simultaneously fighting France, Spain, and the Dutch across every ocean in the world. It was not enough, and American independence was the result. The question worth sitting with is this: if France had stayed out of the war, if the global balance had not shifted in 1778, could the Navy have done it? Could a sustained, well-resourced blockade have strangled the revolution before it took root? We will never know. History does not run experiments, but the men who lived through it, on both sides, suspected that the answer was closer than most Americans have ever wanted to admit. If that changes how you think about who really won the revolution, hit subscribe. Every week on Reckoning, we cover the full history behind the wars, decisions, and people that shaped the world you live in. Drop a comment. Do you think America wins without French intervention at sea? We read everyone. And if you learned something today, the like button helps more people find this channel. We will see you in the next one.